Poor Margaret, she has nothing left now, someone whispered behind me at the funeral, just loud enough for me to hear, just soft enough to pretend it was not meant for me, and I remember thinking how strange it was that people could stand in a room filled with flowers, polished wood, and decades of shared history and still see only what they expected to see, a fragile old woman in black, hands folded, eyes lowered. Someone who had just lost her husband and, in their minds, everything else. Along with him, I stood there beside Noel's casket, the scent of lilies heavy in the air, the murmur of polite condolences moving around me like distant waves, and I nodded when people spoke, I thanked them when they said they were sorry, I accepted their gentle touches on my arm as if I needed help standing, as if grief had already hollowed me out into something helpless, and all the while I could feel their eyes measuring me, calculating what would happen next, where I would go, how long it would take before I became someone else's responsibility, someone to be managed, someone to be pitied. I caught sight of my son Daniel across the room, standing beside his wife Sophia, his hand resting lightly at her back, guiding her as they spoke to guests, and there was something in the way they carried themselves that felt different, not grief exactly, but a quiet confidence, a certainty that life was already rearranging itself in their favor. Sophia's eyes met mine briefly, and she gave me a small, practiced smile, the kind that looked kind from a distance but never quite reached the eyes, and then she leaned closer to Daniel, whispering something that made him nod almost immediately, and I did not need to hear the words to understand the direction of the conversation, because I had lived long enough to recognize that tone, that subtle shift when concern becomes opportunity, when sympathy begins to carry an edge. I turned back toward Noel, toward the man who had built a life with me brick by brick, who had always spoken quietly but with a certainty that never wavered, and I remembered something he told me just a few months before he passed, sitting at the kitchen table with his reading glasses low on his nose, papers spread out in careful order. He had looked at me in that steady way of his and said, "Margaret, if anything ever happens to me, promise me you will not let anyone rush you, not decisions, not papers, not anything." And I had laughed softly at the time, telling him he worried too much, telling him that our family would take care of me, that Daniel would never let anything happen. And he had just nodded, not arguing, just watching me with that quiet understanding that I did not fully grasp until now. The pastor's voice drifted through the room, speaking about legacy and love, about the life Noel had lived, and people bowed their heads respectfully, but I remained still, my eyes open, my thoughts clear in a way that surprised me, because beneath the weight of grief there was something else beginning to settle into place, something steady and cold. I noticed how quickly conversations shifted when they thought I was not listening, how often the word practical came up, how Sophia gently suggested to a relative that I would probably need help managing things soon, and how Daniel did not correct her, did not hesitate, just agreed in that quiet, agreeable way he had learned over the years, and that was the moment I understood that what they saw when they looked at me was not who I was, it was who they needed me to be, someone small, someone dependent, someone easy to guide into decisions that would benefit them, and I could have corrected them right then. I could have told them the truth, could have watched their expressions change as quickly as their assumptions had formed, but I did not. I simply lowered my gaze again, folded my hands, and let them continue believing exactly what they wanted, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let people be completely wrong about you for just a little while longer. The next morning came too quickly, the sunlight slipping through the kitchen window in thin, quiet lines that stretched across the floor, and I found myself standing at the counter with a cup of coffee I had already forgotten to drink, listening to the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, each second marking a new reality I was still adjusting to, and it was there, in that quiet routine that used to feel so ordinary, that I noticed the first shift, not in the house, but in the way others were beginning to move around it, because by mid-morning my phone rang, and when I saw Daniel's name on the screen, I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to hear the urgency in it. And when I finally picked up, his voice was softer than usual, careful, measured, the way people speak when they believe they are stepping into responsibility. He asked how I was doing, if I had eaten, if I needed anything, and I could hear Sophia in the background, her voice low but present, guiding the conversation without ever taking the phone, and I answered simply, calmly, telling him I was managing, telling him everything was fine, and there was a pause on the line. Just long enough for me to understand that this was not the answer they expected, because People who believe you are helpless often look for signs of it, small confirmations that justify their next move, and when they do not find those signs, they begin to create them. Daniel cleared his throat and mentioned that he and Sophia were thinking of stopping by later, just to check on me, just to make sure everything around the house was in order, and the words sounded harmless, even caring, but there was something underneath them, something structured, as if this visit had already been discussed, already been planned, and I agreed without hesitation, because saying no would have raised questions I was not ready to answer, and saying yes would give me something far more valuable: time to observe, time to listen, time to understand exactly how far their assumptions had gone. The hours passed slowly after that, and I spent them moving through the house with intention, not changing anything, not rearranging a single object, but noticing details I had once overlooked: the folder Noel had left in the study drawer, the small envelope tucked behind his old ledger, the quiet presence of things that had always been there but had never needed my full attention until now, and I did not open them yet. I did not rush, because Noel's voice echoed clearly in my mind, reminding me again not to let anyone rush me, not even myself. And when the sound of a car pulling into the driveway finally broke the afternoon stillness, I set my cup down and walked to the front door with steady steps, opening it just as Daniel reached the porch, Sophia standing beside him with that same composed expression she had worn the day before, and they both smiled when they saw me, warm, polite, almost rehearsed, and I stepped aside to let them in, watching closely as their eyes moved through the house, taking in the furniture, the walls, the space itself, not with nostalgia, but with quiet assessment, and that was when I understood that this visit was not about checking on me at all. It was about beginning something they believed had already started the moment Noel was gone, and as I closed the door behind them, I realized that whatever came next would not be decided by what they said out loud, but by what they revealed when they thought I was not paying attention. They settled into the living room with an ease that felt almost practiced, Daniel choosing the armchair across from me while Sophia remained standing for a moment, her eyes drifting over the shelves, the framed photographs, the details that told the story of a life she had never fully been part of, and then she sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, a quiet signal of unity that did not go unnoticed. I offered them coffee out of habit more than intention, and Sophia smiled politely but declined, saying they would not stay long, though something in her tone suggested the opposite, as if this visit had layers that would take time to unfold. Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, and for a brief moment I saw the boy he used to be, the one who would sit like that when he needed to ask for something, but the hesitation that used to follow was gone now, replaced by a kind of quiet confidence that did not belong to him alone. "Mom," he began, his voice careful, "we have been thinking about you," and I nodded gently, encouraging him to continue without offering anything in return, because silence, I had learned, often reveals more than questions ever could. Sophia picked up where he left off, her voice smooth, measured, explaining that they understood how overwhelming everything must feel for me, how managing a house this size could become difficult, how finances could get complicated without Noel here, and each word was wrapped in concern, but beneath it there was structure, intention, a direction they were slowly guiding the conversation toward. I listened without interruption, my hands folded loosely in my lap, my expression calm, and when she mentioned that it might be helpful for them to take a look at the financial documents, just to make sure everything was in order, I felt something inside me settle into place, not surprise, not anger, but recognition, because this was not a spontaneous suggestion, it was a step, one that had likely been discussed long before they walked through my door. Daniel nodded as she spoke, adding that it would only be temporary, just until I got back on my feet, just until things felt normal again, and I noticed how easily the language shifted from support to control, from helping to managing, and I allowed a small pause to fill the room before responding, not long enough to create tension, but long enough for them to wonder what I might say that might be helpful. I said finally, my voice soft, steady, and I watched the subtle change in their posture, the way Sophia's shoulders relaxed just slightly, the way Daniel exhaled as if a quiet concern had been resolved, and in that moment I understood that they had expected resistance, had prepared for hesitation, and my agreement had given them something they valued far more, confirmation. I stood slowly and walked toward the hallway, telling them I would gather what I could find, and as I moved away, I could feel their eyes following me, not with worry, but with anticipation. And once I reached the study, I paused just inside the doorway, my hand resting lightly against the desk where Noel used to sit, and I looked down at the drawer he had always kept locked, the one he had opened just once in front of me, weeks before he passed, when he told me not to let anyone rush me, and for a moment I considered opening it now, revealing everything, ending whatever quiet assumptions were already forming in the next room, but instead I closed my eyes briefly and stepped back, choosing patience over impulse, because whatever they believed they were gaining today was built entirely on what I allowed them to see, and for now, I intended to let them see exactly what they expected. I returned to the living room with a small stack of papers. Nothing significant, just old utility bills, a few outdated statements, the kind of documents that looked important at a glance but revealed very little upon closer inspection, and I placed them carefully on the coffee table between us, watching as Sophia leaned forward almost immediately, her fingers moving with a quiet eagerness as she began sorting through them, her expression focused, analytical, as if she were searching for something specific, something she expected to find. Daniel sat beside her, glancing over her shoulder, nodding occasionally as she pointed out dates and amounts, their heads close together in a way that felt less like concern and more like collaboration, and I remained where I was, sitting back in my chair, observing without interruption, because this moment was not about what was on those pages, it was about what they believed those pages represented, and more importantly, what they believed was missing. Sophia asked a few questions, her tone still polite, but now carrying a sharper edge, asking if there were other accounts, other records, anything Noel might have kept separate, and I answered simply, calmly, telling her that Noel had always handled most of those things himself, that I was not entirely sure where everything was, and I watched the way her eyes flickered briefly, the way she exchanged a quick glance with Daniel, a silent conversation passing between them in a fraction of a second, because uncertainty, to someone looking for control, is both an obstacle and an opportunity. Daniel cleared his throat and shifted slightly in his seat, suggesting that perhaps they could help organize things over the next few days, maybe even bring in someone who could assist professionally, someone who could make sense of it all, and I nodded again, allowing the idea to settle in the room without resistance, because every suggestion they made revealed more than they realized, every step forward they proposed showed me exactly how far they intended to go, and as Sophia gathered the papers into a neat pile, placing them back on the table with a sense of quiet accomplishment, I could see it clearly now, not just their intentions, but their confidence, the belief that they were already moving in the right direction, that this was a process they could manage, guide, eventually control, and I let that belief remain untouched, because correcting it too soon would have closed a door I needed open just a little longer. After a few more minutes of conversation, they stood to leave, their demeanor lighter than when they arrived, their voices carrying a subtle reassurance that everything would be handled, that I was not alone in this, and I walked them to the door, thanking them for coming, watching as they stepped out onto the porch, Daniel offering a brief hug, Sophia giving another one of her practiced smiles, and as I closed the door behind them, the house returned to its familiar silence, but this time it felt different, not heavy, not uncertain, but clear, because now I knew exactly where they stood, and more importantly, I knew exactly what they did not know. I turned back toward the living room, my gaze settling once more on the hallway that led to the study, and after a moment, I walked toward it with steady steps, opening the door and moving directly to the desk, my hand reaching for the drawer Noel had kept locked, and this time I did not hesitate. The key was exactly where he had told me it would be, tucked behind the small frame of our wedding photo, and as I unlocked the drawer and pulled it open, I found everything exactly as he had left it, organized, deliberate, waiting, documents neatly arranged. A sealed envelope resting on top, my name written on it in his familiar handwriting, and as I picked it up, I felt that same quiet certainty he had always carried, the sense that he had seen something I had prepared for something I had not yet understood, and as I opened the envelope slowly, carefully, I realized that whatever came next would not be shaped by assumptions or appearances, but by the truth he had chosen to leave in my hands. I unfolded the letter slowly, careful not to rush through the moment as if speed could somehow soften what I was about to read, and Noel's handwriting greeted me in the same steady, deliberate strokes I had known for decades, each word placed with intention, each sentence carrying the quiet weight of a man who never spoke more than he needed to, and as my eyes moved across the page, I felt something shift inside me, not shock, not even surprise, but recognition, because this was the voice of the man who had always seen further than I did, who had prepared for possibilities I had dismissed. He wrote about the years we had built together, about the choices we made, about the sacrifices that had shaped our life, but beneath those memories was something else, something practical, something precise. He explained that he had moved a significant portion of our assets into a private trust, one that existed entirely outside of the accounts Daniel believed he understood, one that had been structured carefully, legally, and completely under my control, and I paused there for a moment, letting that sentence settle, feeling the quiet magnitude of it, not just the amount itself, but the intention behind it, because Noel had not done this out of secrecy. He had done it out of protection, not from strangers, but from assumptions, from the kind of quiet entitlement that grows when people believe they already know what belongs to them. I continued reading, my hand steady now, my thoughts clear, as he outlined the details, the account numbers, the legal contacts, the steps I would need to take if I ever felt pressured or uncertain. And then there was a final line, simple, almost understated, but unmistakable in its meaning: you do not need to prove anything to anyone, Margaret, but you should never let anyone decide for you. And I sat back in the chair, the letter resting lightly in my hands, and for a moment I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what he had given me, not just security, not just control, but clarity, because everything I had sensed over the past few days, every glance, every carefully chosen word, every quiet assumption, it all fit into place now. They were not just concerned, they were positioning themselves, step by step, guided by the belief that I was vulnerable, that I needed direction, that I would eventually hand over the responsibility they had already begun to claim, and I could see now how easily that would have happened if Noel had not prepared, if I had not opened this drawer, if I had accepted their help without question. The path was already laid out for me, subtle, polite, but leading somewhere very specific, and as I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, I felt something settle inside me, something firm and unshakable, because for the first time since the funeral, I was not reacting. I was deciding. I stood up slowly and looked around the study, at the desk, the shelves, the quiet order Noel had left behind, and I realized that nothing in this house had been left unfinished, nothing had been left uncertain. The only uncertainty had been mine, and now that it was gone, everything else became simple. I would not confront them yet, I would not reveal what I knew, because timing, Noel had always said, was as important as truth, and right now, they were still speaking freely, still showing me exactly who they were when they believed I did not understand, and that was something far more valuable than any immediate reaction. I closed the drawer, locked it again, and placed the key back where it belonged. Then I walked out of the study with steady steps, carrying nothing in my hands, but knowing that I held something far greater than anything they were expecting. The following days unfolded with a kind of quiet precision that would have gone unnoticed if I had not been looking for it. Small changes in tone, in timing, in the way Daniel and Sophia began to insert themselves more deliberately into the rhythm of my life. Phone calls came more frequently now, always polite, always framed as concern, asking if I had reviewed any more documents, if I needed help sorting through things, if perhaps it would be easier if they started handling certain responsibilities on my behalf, and I answered each question the same way, calmly, without resistance, offering just enough uncertainty to keep them engaged, just enough agreement to keep them confident, because confidence, I had come to understand, made people careless, and carelessness revealed truth. They visited again 2 days later, arriving with a sense of purpose that was no longer subtle, Sophia carrying a folder this time, Daniel following closely behind, and as they settled into the living room once more, I noticed how naturally they moved, as if the space was already becoming familiar to them in a different way, not as guests, but as something else entirely. Sophia opened the folder and began explaining that she had spoken with a financial advisor, someone she trusted, someone who could help streamline everything, make sure there were no overlooked liabilities, no unnecessary risks, and her words were smooth, well chosen, but beneath them was a clear direction, a path that led toward consolidation, toward oversight, toward control. Daniel added that it would take a lot of pressure off me, that I deserved to rest, to focus on healing, and I nodded gently, letting the suggestion settle without challenge, because I wanted to hear what came next, and it did not take long. Sophia mentioned that the house itself might be something to consider, not immediately, of course, but eventually, suggesting that a place this size could become burdensome, that downsizing might offer simplicity, comfort, security, and as she spoke, I watched Daniel, waiting for hesitation, for some trace of the boy who once saw this house as home, but there was none, only agreement, quiet and immediate, as if the idea had already been accepted long before it was spoken aloud. I let a small silence form before responding, just enough to draw their attention, and then I asked a simple question: one that seemed harmless on the surface. "And where would I go?" I said, my voice soft, almost uncertain, and the answer came quicker than I expected, Sophia suggesting a community she had researched, a place with amenities, support, people my age, her tone bright, reassuring, as if she were offering me something desirable, and Daniel nodded again, adding that it would be easier for them to visit, easier to manage, easier all around, and in that moment, the final piece fell into place, because this was no longer about helping me navigate uncertainty, it was about guiding me toward a decision they had already made, a future they had already envisioned, one where I was no longer here, no longer central, no longer in control, and I felt no anger as I listened, no shock, only a quiet clarity that settled deeper with every word, because now there was nothing left to guess, nothing left to interpret. They had shown me exactly who they were when they believed I was too lost to see it, and I understood then that whatever happened next would not be about defending what was mine. It would be about deciding when to let them discover just how wrong they had been all along. That evening, after they left, I did not sit down right away. I remained standing in the quiet of the living room, listening to the echo of their voices as if the walls themselves were holding onto every word they had said, and I let the silence stretch, not as something empty, but as something deliberate, because for the first time since Noel passed, I was not reacting to what others expected of me, I was preparing. I walked slowly to the study again. Not with hesitation this time, but with intention, and I opened the drawer without pause, taking out the documents Noel had left behind, spreading them carefully across the desk, each page precise, each instruction clear, and I followed them step by step, not rushing, not skipping anything, because this was not just paperwork, this was the structure he had built to protect everything we had worked for. I picked up the phone and dialed the number he had written at the top of the letter, and when the voice on the other end answered, calm and professional, I introduced myself simply, giving my name, and there was a brief pause before the tone shifted, respectful, familiar, as if my call had been expected even if it had been delayed. We spoke for several minutes, and I confirmed everything Noel had outlined, the trust, the accounts, the legal boundaries that existed beyond what anyone in my family could access or even locate without my consent, and when the call ended, I felt something settle fully into place, not relief, not satisfaction, but certainty, because now there were no assumptions left, no unknowns, only decisions. I gathered the documents again and placed them back exactly as they had been, locking the drawer, returning the key to its place, restoring the room to its quiet order, and then I moved back through the house, noticing how different everything felt now, not because anything had changed physically, but because I understood it differently. The walls, the furniture, the space itself, none of it was uncertain, none of it was at risk. The only thing that had shifted was how others believed they could step into it. And I realized then that the next step was not to confront them, not yet, because confrontation would end the illusion too quickly, and right now that illusion was working in my favor. It allowed them to speak freely, to plan openly, to reveal the full extent of what they intended without realizing they were doing so, and that was something I could not afford to interrupt. The following morning, I made a simple decision, one that seemed small on the surface but carried a quiet purpose beneath it. I called Daniel and told him that I had been thinking about what they said, that perhaps it would be helpful to go over everything together, properly this time, not just a few papers, but all of it, finances, property, future plans, and there was a brief silence on the line before his voice responded, measured but unmistakably pleased, and he agreed immediately, suggesting that Sophia would organize everything, that they could come by at the end of the week, that they would make it simple for me, and I thanked him, my tone steady, my words careful, and when the call ended, I stood there for a moment, holding the phone in my hand, aware that what I had just done was not surrender, it was invitation, but not the kind they believed, because while they were preparing to take control, I was preparing to show them something they had never considered, not through argument, not through emotion, but through truth, and truth, I had learned, did not need to be raised, it only needed to be placed in the right moment, at the right time, and allowed to speak for itself. They arrived exactly on time, not early, not late, the kind of precision that suggested preparation rather than courtesy, and this time they carried more than just polite concern. Sophia had a structured folder in her hands, thicker than before, organized, labeled, deliberate, and Daniel walked in with a quiet confidence that no longer tried to hide itself, as if whatever uncertainty had existed before had already been resolved in their minds. I welcomed them in without hesitation, leading them to the dining table instead of the living room, a small change, but one that shifted the tone immediately, because this was no longer a visit, it was a discussion. A decision, a moment they had been moving towards step by step. Sophia spread her documents across the table with careful precision, explaining everything as she went: financial projections, property evaluations, options for selling, options for relocation, her voice calm and reassuring, presenting each step as if it were already the most reasonable path forward. Daniel added small confirmations, reinforcing her points, agreeing at exactly the right moments, and I listened, my hands resting lightly on the table, my expression unchanged, allowing them to move through their plan completely, uninterrupted, because I wanted to hear all of it, every assumption, every conclusion they had drawn without me. And when they finally finished, when the last page was placed neatly on the table and the room fell into a brief, expectant silence, I nodded slowly, as if considering everything they had said, and then I reached for the envelope I had placed beside me before they arrived, the same one Noel had left, and I set it gently in the center of the table, between us, and for a moment neither of them moved, their eyes shifting from the envelope to me, uncertain, curious, and I opened it without speaking, taking out the documents inside, placing them carefully one by one on top of Sophia's neatly arranged plans, and I watched as her expression changed first, subtle at the beginning, a slight narrowing of her eyes as she scanned the headings, the figures, the legal language that did not align with anything she had prepared. Daniel leaned closer, reading over her shoulder, his brow tightening as he tried to understand what he was seeing, and I remained still, allowing the silence to do its work, allowing the truth to unfold at its own pace. Because explanation was no longer necessary, the document spoke clearly enough: the trust, the accounts, the total valuation laid out in precise detail. And when Sophia finally looked up at me, her composure no longer as steady as before, I spoke for the first time, my voice calm, even, without any need to raise it. Noel made sure everything was taken care of, I said, and I could see the shift immediately, not just in their understanding, but in their position, because everything they had built their confidence on, every assumption, every quiet calculation, had been based on something that was never true. Daniel sat back slowly, his eyes moving between the papers and me, as if trying to reconcile two completely different versions of reality, and Sophia remained silent, her hand still resting on the document she had brought, now overshadowed by something far larger, something she had not anticipated. And I did not add anything more, I did not explain, did not justify, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to negotiate. The truth had already been placed in front of them, clear, complete, undeniable, and as the silence stretched between us, I realized that the moment had finally arrived, not the one they had planned, but the one Noel had prepared for, the moment when everything became exactly what it had always been, not theirs to manage, not theirs to decide, but mine to control. And as I looked at them sitting across from me, no longer certain, no longer composed, I understood that sometimes the strongest response is not resistance, not confrontation, but simply allowing the truth to stand where it belongs and letting everything else fall away around it.